Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. How we fancy with a bright morning? We have a healthy reaction to the benevolent, so grade A climate. I often avoid seeing a TV drama that is partly because I'm busy, and also I rather like to see an old historic a drama of history. So but last night, I have occasion to see Yong Jae-hoon. Do you like Yong Jae-hoon? He's a great person. I once heard he's a global artist to fly from Los Angeles, New York, for his Titan scale business. But actually, I've known that he really is a person. He was an adoptee across time when Korea is so deprived and unexploited. He had a hard time on his early childhood and made a great social success as an artist. And he also is very proactive for Korean beginners of classic. So it would be a great chance to subscribe to his circle. Why not? I also grow some my interest about the classic music recently. It started last spring. And it just 1 year. I have felt many times on classic music for laziness of class and a schedule. So we usually require to stay until the night class begins, so we can have some portion of vacancy for class. I can make time to enjoy classic music and others. So, we continue our discussion on a civil law tradition. We have viewpoints, rather comprehensive and orientational, to expose the framework of a civil law interpretation. The article titled Judicial Interpretation of Written Norms, authored by Alfred Lee in 1979. It was an antedated article, but there is a strong tendency, and continually it is actually classic. This article featured all time in the all-time list. So we have some essence of teachings about understanding the scope of issues involved in interpretive work. interestingly, I had the previous experience to make some very interesting analysis about citation work conducted by Shapiro, Yale Law School, that modeled after the list of novelists. So he picked up a 100 most eminent legal scholars whose article featured most frequently. It is one way to look into the research impact. That kind of an approach are not generally employed by other departments. And it lists all times articles, most helpful to guide. And the article also employs a new way of evaluation about research impact. For example, in these times, videotape is also concerned in the context of the analysis, research analysis. So, in connection with the rise of Psy, you know the name Psy. Yeah, is one of the most popular society pop artists. So, the kind of connection will guide us to correspond the transformation of our society. It is internet society, and we have e-journals and other scope of new ways of learning and teachings. So the traditional citation work may well be seen in reformed ways of viewpoint. Do you agree? Interesting. It was published in 1910. So, and one other teaching comes from a Professor Prout, the change of style in French appellate judgments. So, I like to recall the previous statement that the comparative work involves a scope of features that each tradition has exposed in the carriage of their business. And one way is to see the style of a jurist. For example, this analysis may have some insight between a civil and common law tradition, where common law jurists have lengthy portion of a court opinion presenting the logic, rational, and other sociological issues to teach, and also in the context of a rule formulation. That is the rule, and the court opinion constitutes a source of law, as we have introduced. That is not the case in French system. They have very concise and some mechanical way, which is more clear in some aspect, but less of a sociological deliberation in terms of justice and others. So, we briefly see the introduction about the change which occurred in 1970s in France. And then we advance to the next topic. In 1968, a discussion of the form of French judgments was initiated by an article entitled La Mort des Athènes, written by a procureur general at the Court of Cassation and a senior member of the Court of Appeal in Paris, reported on the reasons for a change in the style of judgment, undertaken by the full chamber of the Court of Appeal in Paris, and on the reactions to it. The court was concerned at the fight of litigants to other tribunals, and at the increasing number of bodies working to make the administration of justice less expensive, faster, and more responsive to current needs. It seemed to the chamber the one way of achieving these ends would be to remedy a judicial linkage. In particular, the real concern was felt the litigants themselves seldom understood on what grounds a decision had been given for or against them. The form of judgment, it was said, should be easily understood by the litigants, not merely meet the formulae of an esoteric juristic art. In changing its style, the First Chamber of Court of Appeal in Paris followed the lead of certain other courts, in particular those of René, Montpellier, and Toulouse, in rejecting the chain of various causes and in presenting the judgment in two parts, for setting out the history of the case and the facts in a direct narrative style, and then the court's decision preceded only by the words on these matters the court. The authors point to the experiment. The experiment in the Court of Appeal was part of a rethinking about French legal procedures and part of a movement within the legal profession to simply judicial language which abounded in absolute and archaic formulae. In 1971, a commission for the renewal of judicial language was set up. Its chairman was Mr. Adolphe Duffet. In 1974, a controversial article written by Duffet and Dunn appeared, in which there was a plea for a more explicit justification of decisions, especially in the Court of Cassation. The authors argue that the most important object in a judgment was to convey the litigants why they had won or lost. The legal principle on which the syllogism was based was frequently not a statute provision. A bare stating of the principle as the major premises left the reader guessing as to why the court had chosen among other possible principles. This was particularly true where France's Supreme Tribunal is developing the law in new areas. Furthermore, the classification of facts was often debatable, but no record of factors which influence the court in this respect would be available. So, we have dual aspect in dilemma between efficiency of a justice administration and some service factor to the client. Many clients, in the nature of things, usually want to see what the court judges mentioned and also why they reached a conclusion. But there are shortage of resources in code usually, and that is also the case in Korea. So Korean authority have long deliberated on that issue, and some concise form of a judgment was available in modality to scope of judges. In the previous occasion, we see some a criticism featured in a newspaper article that a judge have neglected on his duty by writing the judgment in extremely curtailed forms. So, is this a court opinion, a judgment that the client, which should be delivered to the client? So, that a shock and other ways of a motivation led the reporter to read the article. Later, some version was raised about the actuality of the case where it is usual practice in court, but it is just recommended. So not the court authority actually did not impose some strict rules about the style of law. So it falls within the preserve of each respective jurors, and the style is also concerned in terms of its personality for each judge. So, in France, the Supreme Tribunal is also developing the law in new areas, kind of a total, as we have discussed, evolve to model after a liberance of a sophistication of a common laws developed by the United States. Some German influence from sociological force also is mixed up with shaping of a new tradition in France. Then there are complicated elements that we need to consider in expanding the official practices of a justice administration. The classification of facts was often debatable, as I said. In principle, the court cassation only reviews decision of law, not decisions as to fact, but where she in fact decides to apply a different legal principle and has obviously classified the facts differently. Once the principle was enshrined in a case, it will be cited over and over, even though subsequent developments might prove it more and more unfortunate, because all discussion of its social consequences was excluded. It was almost impossible to change it without the appearance of a revolution. The simple negation of a principle always ought to have been settled a jurisprudence. Without any argument in explanation is hardly reassuring. The most serious criticism made against the classic style of a judgment, the guru of the cassation, is that it appears to separate the law from reality. Questions, so there is a point with this difference between France and Germany. What is reality? For example, American realism in legal preserve usually includes the scope of a sociological deliberation to find the truth of laws and weight of actual dynamics through the the society in general. For some cases, specifically research about it involves in some cases a racial realism in law. Female female element seriously considered or may feature in postmodern narrative how the law interacts in society in terms of gender. So this is actually a challenge the French authority has to meet it up. Questions of economic or simply practical effects, such as the existence of insurance practices, of social security, the economic effect of holdings relating to manufacturer responsibility or liability for nuclear damage cannot be accommodated in the judgment. All this is true, but the separation of law from life goes even further, for it is not only, as the authors suggest, that non-legal but also subsidiary legal argument cannot be given their full weight in the highly formalistic style of judging. So they are kind of a formal study of law and some sociological study of law. How do you agree if that should be separated? And a sociological study flourished in the United States and also in Germany. You can see the intelligence transpiring between two continents. For example, a critical theory initially developed by Germany. You know the name. I'm sorry. Who is a forefather of a critical legal theory is from Germany. I cannot make a name instantly now. And it influences the legal study in the United States. For example, some law school has bred a kind of a tradition involving in the research of a minority in the United States. One illustration is notable in law school, University of Wisconsin, where I studied. The law school launched a Haste Fellowship, and it leads the student to eventually obtain a LLM degree and 2 years course, and they funded this time. And they produced a law professors, which is unusual for some races, for example. And the intelligence circle is also highly influential about the area of law. And for example, one scholar featured in the all-time jurist, who is a graduate of Haste Fellow. It is very rare to be enlisted in 100 list. And particularly the graduate degree in law in the United States is not popular. Some selected racial minority usually pursue that degree, particularly the lawyers from foreign countries. East Asia and other European countries. So the teaching profession are also heavily dominated by JD students, and it's very unusual to see law professor with a graduate degree. They usually have LLB or a JD degree. The LLM student from his fellowship has had a considerable scope of a professorship in the United States. And as a comparative test, you need to know some basic information about legal education, some kind of intelligent interaction between the country. I have much extensively foregone the scope of a debate about the matters, legal education and legal profession, since I saw the sources of law would be more important to have you be exposed on this subject. All this is true, but the separation of law from life goes even further, for it is not only, as the author suggests, that non-legal but also subsidiary legal arguments cannot be given their full weight in the highly formalistic style of judgment. The dominating principle of judgment, non-legal courtesan de esprit et français, as well as the one-sentence form, tends to emphasize one specific reason as the determining one and to subordinate all others to it, or indeed omit them altogether, as Morris in a typical practical reasoning relating to problems of how people should behave, to be an accumulation of various types of arguments, no one of which is in itself decisive. The total weight of which is. Further flow in the classical theory of the French judgment can be illustrated from the mouths of its own supporters. The judgment, it is said, must express le motif que determine the decision. At the same time, it is suggested that cour de cassation has indeed considered economic and social consequences in coming to its decisions. So, it may sound unusually, I pronounce the words of France in an American way. Are you enjoying my statement? Even though it is not expressed as judgments, this can of course clearly be illustrated to say by the reversal of the laws as to liability for injury to the non-paying a passenger. Clearly then, the court has not set out in its judgment the reason which moved it to take that decision. This contradiction arises because more writers on the judicial process in France do not make the distinction, fundamental in common law legal theory, between the psychological process of judgment, which leads to the decision, and the justification of the decision, which must conform to certain norms of a judicial behavior. In whatever way a judge reaches a decision, he must be able to justify it by acceptable methods. An intuitive decision will still be an acceptable one if he can demonstrate that it is consistent with certain standard judicial techniques. This point has been lucidly made by the German theorist Joseph S. Judges, he says, approach a decision with a certain orientation or predisposition which is drawn from the values about justice, life, and the society he serves. They guide him, often almost by instinct, to what would be an acceptable, feasible, or plausible solution. He then chooses among the various judicial technological or structural methods of interpretation the one which leads to the result already a foreshadow. If the court of the cassation had indeed taken account of what the community feels to be reasonable in cases of transport without reward in moral accident cases, then it's a justification of the decision in terms of purely legal principle does not express any more than do the judgments of German judges, the reasons which decided the issue. Concentrating exclusively on traditional techniques of judicial style may leave the judge without any guidance for and society with no control of the most crucial stage of a judicial decision. The analysis of Dupre and Tong, though not going so far, they suggest that the judge should mention all the factors which has entered into his consideration. Not only would this be clear to the litigants, but also to counsel, academic writers, legal advisors, and not least of all, to lower court from whose decision the litigant appeal. It is true that this would open up a more debate about judicial decisions, but it is through debate that developments appear. Though the author related the inspiration for their proposals to Baudelaires' description of function of the cause, which necessarily required a clarity in judgments. There were no illusions as to the opposition the proposed change would arise in those already critical of changes made the Paris Court of Appeal. Baudelaire is an important figure when we study the Court of Napoleon. Is extensive over the interaction of various legal traditions, eventually leading to a very refined form of Court of Napoleon. And his viewpoint is also concerns the ways of a primitive way on sociological necessities in shaping a new order of a European continent. So his viewpoint is critically important to understand the background of a French legal civilization. This opposition is clearly brought out in another article by a member of the Court of Cassation, in which apparently represents a strong faction of opinion in French judicial world, if not within Court of Cassation itself. It has gone. Why? Oops. You have no vision entirely. It has disappeared. What happened? It changes proposed it's a serious disadvantages. A major one would be the encouragement given to judges to ramble on in the discursive and irrelevant style of German common law judges. The discussion of social and economic forces would be inappropriate judges who are not trained in these fields. The court's deliberations would become longer, and this would slow up the course of justice. more discussion were included in the court's cassation, court's decisions, and it therefore became proper to allow individual judicial opinions. This would be disastrous. The destruction of judicial privilege would facilitate a political pressure on the judges. It now weakened the authority of the court, not only generally, but also in respect of lower courts, which might prefer to associate themselves with the minority view. It will plunge practitioners into an area of perplexity. Brethren saw as probably the only fault of classic style of judgment that is sometimes elliptical. If the judges guard against excessive brevity, then the traditional style is an excellent instrument, expression de la pensée juridique. You know the word, pensée. There also seem to be a slight sense of resentment at a suggestion the French practice could learn anything useful from the common law. And there are still the article titled Pensée, and it deals with the scope of a philosophical or fundamental issues about the society. And also, we can see some different paths of education. For example, France still maintain the grandmother type, and the level of a degree or conferred by academic institutions usually have some varied form. For example, they use a diploma for granting grant, which is compatible with the Anglo-Saxon counterpart as a master. It positioned between doctor and master degrees. And a group of alumni from a prestigious Grand École worked extensively over a major social post in France, business and politics. And the entrance exam is so competitive. You may see some in-depth meditation of examiners in exam Paris for the admission of the French. So they cherish some in-person passages of a meditation as a precious resources of each person intellectual intelligence in each person. So the kind of different ways of breeding a level of a social element also influence the tradition of society at the extent of a large society, and also particularly within the preserve of a judicial resources. So how the judges deliberate on these state polls are usually influenced by their educational experience. So they may make a short, far curtailed form of judgment, probably. What factors do you think affect their ways of dealing? One may say the Napoleon may fall to get it curtailed, and the other may say some educational element could operate to shape their working pattern. These rules of doom must appreciate the Commission to approach changes in drafting of judgment gently. The ministerial circular to court presidents of a 34th January 1977, recommending the drafting of judgments in a clearer and more direct style, is described as invitation to the judges, not an order. The Minister of Justice, in distributing the recommendations of the Commission, said that its proposals, including the partial elimination of the attendance, is a complete approval. I'm convinced that litigants, most of whom have these words are from Minister of Justice. I am convinced the litigants, most of whom have difficulty in understanding a judgment in its classical construction, will be able, by means of this new presentation, to better distinguish the facts of the case and the claims of the parties from the reasoning of the court itself, and because of this, grasp more easily the solution to the case. The chief proposal is to do away with the expressions "identical" and "constant." Some courts apparent would have favored the total suppression, but the Commission finally followed the solution tried out by the Superior Court of Appeal in 1968, of having the first part of judgment describing the course of litigation in a simple descriptive style and retaining the tenders for the court's actual decision. Another recommendation is to adopt a very flexible approach and to vary the style of judgment to type of case, giving more headings or subdivisions where appropriate, or even varying the order of a presentation. Subheading are to be used to break up the text. The Commission emphasized that this change of style was not to alter the aim of a conciseness. Dropping the attendance, it should simply mean the use of a simple sentence of one or two phrases. It is noteworthy in this respect that the descriptive part of the third court's judgment, considered by Mallet and Dufay in 1968, could be quite simply reconstituted in the classic style by adding a considerable before each sentence. Finally, the Commission offered a model, handle, which should contain the essential facts about the case and those factors required by statute to be part of judgment. The motive behind all the Commission's proposals is clearly to free judgments of esoteric, juristic mysteries, and make them comprehensible on which one might would surely have been dear to the hearts of drafters of the French Code, a model of the expression of legal relationship in simple, clear language. Like the French Civil Code, but in consonance with the views of Baudelaire, some of the other 19th century codes openly acknowledged and dealt with the problem of silence or insufficiency of rest of text. The Austrian Civil Code of 1811, which had been in preparation of the latter part of the 18th century and was strongly influenced by natural law ideas, directs the judge to look to the principles of natural justice. The Spanish Civil Code of 1888 provides that deficiencies in the law shall be supplied by reference to general principles of law, understood as those principles which can be derived from the rules of positive law. The draftsman of German Civil Code considered including some such general interpretive directions, but eventually rejected the idea because it was found that the code implicitly contained its own methods of interpretation. if the ordinary method of exegesis inherent in the structure and system of code yielded no answer. It was anticipated that the judge would resort to general principles, nor limited to those discoveries in the positive world, however, but including those principles which arise from the spirit of the legal order. This concept was later made an explicit direction in Article 12 of Italian law on interpretation of list of text. The most famous of all such interpretive decisions, interpretive directions, is contained in Article 1 of Swiss Civil Code of 1907, which provides that if the judge can find no rule in the statute, he must decide in accordance with customary law, and failing according to the law which he as a legislator would adopt, having regard to approved legal doctrine and judicial tradition. This provision, with its unprecedented grant of authority to the judge, was regarded at the time by content legal theorists as revolutionary. In fact, however, in the years since the Swiss Civil Code has been enforced, Article 1 has been rarely used. Swiss judges almost always preferring to couch their decisions in the language of traditional methods of interpretation. So how to, yeah, you may leave. And your name, please. So we normally state the need of construction when we are initially exposed to basic facts or other rare information of flow level. So social construction also considered as one important way of intelligence. How to differentiate the interpretation from social construction? The common law jurists usually say the ways of intellectual operation by the word social construction. The interpretation would rather have been nuanced in some absolute context of a authority, which could be granted by this parent or some kind of authoritative a system of a political branch. You see the difference between the public order or legal structure between two legal traditions. Of course, I like to remind that there is a strong tendency on convergence and divergence. So you have introduced it briefly, and a further will be on some context of interpretation, but there are always some similarities and dissimilarities. In Germany, let's get forward. After the initial period of conventional exegesis, judges began to exercise their authority to adapt and develop the law openly. They have developed an opinion style which resembles the American in its attention to the facts and exposition of the reasoning process through which the court arrives at its decision. As anticipated by the draft of German Civil Code, the courts have not considered themselves to be tightly confined within the limits of a statute authority. They have, however, taken seriously the idea that they are bound by the legal order, the idea of law as a whole. They care when exercising what may be called a creative function to incorporate new institutions into the framework of the legal order and to conform them to the basic principles of the legal order has been admired by many foreign observers. In general, the court's authority to develop the law in this fashion is undisputed in present-day West Germany, although there is there, as elsewhere, disagreement as to the limits of such power. In summary, it can be said that while modern theory of interpretation generally acknowledges the principles are hard to identify, and the judges dealing with list of texts are often making law, the extent to which the behavior of the courts reflects this perception varies. It varies not so much in the results achieved as it does in the degree to which the process is open or concealed. In France, where the process tends to be hidden, Dawson has pointed out that the absence of the reasoned opinion deprives the system of a valuable tool and an important mechanism for controlling the discretion of judges. So see if civil law judges could entertain a more expanded scope of leeway in delivering the judgment. In West Germany, where the process is more open, criticism tends to focus on the democratic problem. What limit should there be on the legal and political decision-making power of an official who is neither representative nor politically accountable? So you have been introduced into the interpretation. One of a major, when you think about a civil law tradition, and this morning noticed that there are still controversies between the Supreme Court of Korea and the Constitutional Court about constitutional scope of powers. They are generally considered to be interpretive body of a supreme document of Korea. How do you see the entrenched strugglers stretching since from 1987, in early 1999 through 2013 nowadays. They have now resolved concerning the final authority about interpretation of law. Who is responsible, principally responsible for the interpretation of law? Which organs could be more properly construct the statute given to the which falls within the responsibility. We have a dual hierarchy of a judiciary, as I've introduced, and the kind of a final authority may not be determined by the Constitution called the document of Constitution itself. That is dilemma posed to the current debate. So in the Constitution, we often agree that exclusive authority about the interpretation of a statute and other public ordinance or executive orders of a president vested within the normal Supreme Court. We have a separate line of authority expected to interact. But the Constitution Code has actually devised some varied form of judgment, which concerns the hardship usually challenged by the ambiguities of a constitutional language. In statute terms, they are only empowered to say it is unconstitutional or it is constitutional. And the effect of judgment is very formalistic, to have a prospective binding power. So all the branches of government should obey the judgment, and it is one way the statute, a written provision, has emphasized to give the effect. But the Constitution Code, so it fairly limited to expectedly exercise their power delegated by the Constitution. So they have put some conditions in the final arbitration. And if the conditions are met, the provision should be deemed a constitutional. If the conditions fail, then the statute should be annulled. The provision should be annulled. So, you can see the nature of issues in connection with the interpretation of a statute. It is fairly the role and responsibility that the Supreme Court, not the Constitutional Court, has been expected to undertake in the normal way of normal scope of a justice business. Then the Supreme Court found it contravenes the constitutional command. How do you agree if the Supreme Court is right? Then they propose the Constitutional Court has to play a limited role, which may render them backward long before to the real times of a constitutional culture. We have long practices constitutional democracy since 1958. But before this new constitution created in 1987, we have so small number of cases which actually mattered with a constitutional issue. Virtually, we have a skeleton of small provisions provided by Constitution with no substantial case rules. That phenomenon has been revolutionarily transformed if we create a new constitution, another code. So we now have a refined scope of case rules, which is esoteric for the foreigners, since it is national constitution, but also a very educative. And one strength of Constitution Code, a feature in a democratic education, the language and their beliefs presented in the argument would have the value of fundamental guidance for the governmental branches and also people at large. And we have a very civilized form of a constitutional system which modeled after the Austrian model of a dual system, as I later reiterated. And a comparative study is now being now a flourished to reform more comprehensively and agilely to combat for a new issues also. So, I should have to renege on the rest of a topic. Initially, it was planned to be completed, but I have to stop here. Time limits. So, there's a work for the next class. Thank you. And please, can you please practice as usual for your names? Thank you. See you next time.